Early morning. The air is cold and damp. Somewhere along the French coast, boots press into wet sand as German soldiers stand facing west. Across the narrow strip of gray water lies Britain, close enough to imagine, too far to touch. The men have been told this island is tired, an empire past its strength, a nation that talks but will not endure. Yet the channel does not feel like a border. It feels like a pause. Above them, engines fade into the clouds, bombers returning, some fewer than before. On the ground, rifles are cleaned in silence. No cheering, no songs. Letters are written at night, not for censors, for wives, brothers, parents. In those letters, the language begins to change. Confidence gives way to irritation. Irritation turns into caution. Britain does not behave as expected. It does not ask for terms. It does not crack under pressure. And slowly, among the men ordered to defeat it, a question takes hold. Not spoken aloud, but shared in glances and unfinished sentences. What kind of enemy refuses to fall when it is supposed to? That question will follow German soldiers for the rest of the war, and it begins here. Before the war begins, Britain exists in the German soldier's mind as an idea rather than a reality. An old enemy, a distant one, a power remembered more from history books than from lived experience. For decades, German military education had framed Britain as a declining empire, wealthy, overextended, dependent on colonies, slow to react. The memory of the First World War lingered, but it was shaped by bitterness rather than clarity. Britain had not been defeated then, but neither had it delivered the decisive blow. To many in Germany's new armed forces, Britain was not feared. It was resented and underestimated. The political messaging of the late 1930s reinforced this view. Britain was portrayed as decadent, governed by compromise, unwilling to endure hardship. German soldiers entering service heard repeatedly that Britain's strength was an illusion, maintained by money, sea lanes, and outdated prestige rather than by will. Training manuals focused on continental warfare. The decisive battles were expected to be fought on land. Britain, separated by water, was considered strategically awkward but psychologically weak. The assumption was simple. Once confronted with pressure, Britain would negotiate. When war begins in September 1939, that assumption remains intact. German soldiers fighting in Poland hear little about Britain beyond radio bulletins. It is France that dominates their thoughts. Britain feels distant, abstract, an enemy that exists mostly on maps and in speeches. Even after the rapid campaign in the West in 1940, confidence remains high. The fall of France shocks Europe, but within German ranks it reinforces belief rather than caution. If France could collapse in weeks, Britain, isolated and exposed, should follow. Soldiers moving through captured territory speak casually of England. Some expect to see it soon. Others expect it to surrender before invasion becomes necessary. The tone is not hatred. It is dismissal. Yet beneath that confidence, there is uncertainty. Britain has not asked for peace. Its government has not fallen. Its navy still controls the sea. German officers note this in reports, privately at first, then with growing frequency. The British refusal to negotiate after France's defeat is unexpected. It disrupts the assumed timeline of the war. For the average soldier, this contradiction creates tension. The propaganda promises collapse. Reality offers resistance. Letters home begin to reflect this gap. Britain is described as stubborn, irritating, unreasonable. The language remains dismissive, but the certainty is gone. There is also confusion about Britain's people. German soldiers have been taught that British civilians are complacent, unwilling to endure sacrifice. Yet air crews report cities still functioning after raids. Naval personnel speak of British escorts that continue fighting despite losses. Intelligence summaries note civilian morale holding firm. These reports are not broadcast loudly. They circulate quietly, through conversations, through personal correspondence, through small details that do not fit the narrative. By mid-1940, Britain is no longer just a strategic obstacle. It is becoming a psychological one. German soldiers sense that something is wrong with the assumptions they were given. Not enough to doubt victory. Not yet, but enough to provoke unease. The enemy across the Channel is behaving like a nation that expects a long war and is prepared to endure it. That realization does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates. One delayed surrender, one failed negotiation, one more British convoy at sea, one more aircraft returning damaged but not destroyed. Slowly, Britain stops being distant, stops being theoretical, and as direct contact increases, German soldiers begin forming opinions not from speeches, but from experience. Those opinions will change everything. By the summer of 1940, Britain can no longer be dismissed from a distance. It is encountered. The collapse of France brings German forces to the edge of the Channel. For the first time, many soldiers stand within sight of the island they were told would soon surrender. The water between them feels narrow. Deceptively so. Orders shift. Attention turns westward. The Luftwaffe becomes the primary instrument of pressure, and with it comes the first sustained personal contact between German servicemen and British resistance. Pilots who had flown uncontested skies over Poland and France now meet organized opposition. Radar-guided fighters, coordinated anti-aircraft fire, an enemy that responds quickly and intelligently. After-action reports change tone. British pilots are no longer described as disorganized. They're described as aggressive, persistent, well-directed. Fighter crews speak of engagements that do not break apart as expected. RAF squadrons disengage, regroup, and return. Losses are inflicted, but not at the rate predicted. The air war becomes a contest rather than a sweep. On the ground, coastal artillery units and infantry detachments receive updates that are increasingly cautious. Britain is not merely defending itself, it is adapting. Airfields are repaired overnight. Communications remain intact. Civilian movement continues. Naval encounters deepen this impression. U-boat crews operating in the Atlantic expect Britain's maritime lifelines to collapse under pressure. Instead, convoys tighten. Escorts multiply. Losses occur on both sides, but British shipping does not cease. Reports from the sea speak of a navy that absorbs damage and keeps functioning. For German sailors, this is unsettling. Britain's strength at sea is no longer theoretical. It is experienced through depth charges, radar sweeps, and sudden counterattacks. The Royal Navy feels present everywhere. Relentless. Methodical. Meanwhile, invasion plans circulate through command channels. Operation Sea Lion is discussed openly enough for soldiers to sense its scale and its risks. Training exercises are conducted. Barges are assembled, but doubts surface. Letters home reveal concern about crossing water under fire, about weather, about British coastal defenses. The tone is no longer triumphant. It is practical, calculating, uneasy. What surprises many German soldiers most is not British firepower, but British behavior. There is no panic, no visible collapse, no sign of desperation. Cities bombed at night continue working by day. Factories resume production. Trains run. Lights return. Civil defense structures operate efficiently. Reports note civilians moving calmly through shelters, returning to damaged homes, rebuilding. This endurance contradicts years of ideological framing. Britain was supposed to be soft, dependent on comfort, unwilling to sacrifice. Instead, it absorbs punishment and remains functional. German intelligence officers note this shift carefully. They observe that British morale, while strained, does not break. Leadership remains stable. Command structures remain intact. There is no internal fracture to exploit. Among the rank and file, frustration grows. They're doing what they were trained to do. They're applying pressure. And yet the enemy does not behave as expected. This creates a psychological strain that is subtle but persistent. Confidence erodes not through defeat, but through delay, through the realization that victory will not come quickly. That Britain is prepared for a long contest. By late 1940, Britain has become something new in the German soldier's mind. Not weak, not collapsing, but stubborn. A nation that refuses to act according to predictions. That refusal forces German soldiers to reassess, not just Britain, but the assumptions that brought them to war. And as contact deepens, those reassessments will become personal, detailed, and unavoidable. Because now, the war is no longer fought against an idea. It is fought against an enemy seen, heard, and felt. For German infantrymen, Britain is first encountered not on the island itself, but through its soldiers, met in scattered engagements, prisoner transfers, and coastal defenses. Early assumptions paint British troops as poorly motivated and slow to react. Yet reports from encounters in Norway, France, and later North Africa complicate that image. British units withdraw under pressure, but rarely disintegrate. They retreat in order. They leave behind traps, mines, and disciplined rearguards. German infantry note this pattern repeatedly. The British soldier is described as calm under fire, less prone to reckless charges, more inclined to hold, delay, and preserve strength. This frustrates German tactics built around rapid encirclement and collapse. Captured British troops surprise their guards. They remain composed, polite, quietly defiant. They do not boast, but they do not beg. Interrogation reports note a reserved confidence, not arrogance, but certainty. For many German soldiers, this is unsettling. They expect fear. They encounter professionalism. As the war progresses, British infantry units increasingly display adaptability. They improve coordination with armor and artillery. They learn from defeats. German soldiers begin referring to them not as inferior, but as methodical. Britain's ground forces are no longer dismissed. They are respected cautiously, sometimes grudgingly. Angle 2. The airman's view confronting the RAF. For Luftwaffe crews, Britain becomes defined by the sky. The Battle of Britain marks a turning point in perception. German pilots had entered the campaign expecting to overwhelm outdated aircraft and inexperienced opponents. Instead, they face a coordinated air defense system unlike anything encountered before. British fighters appear precisely where needed. Radar warnings give them time to climb. Ground controllers guide them into position. The sky becomes contested, unpredictable. German pilots begin noting the discipline of RAF squadrons. British pilots break off when damaged. They return. They fight again. Losses do not end resistance. There's also a psychological element. RAF pilots fight over their own territory. They bail out and return to duty. German pilots fall into captivity. This imbalance weighs heavily. Private letters reveal growing respect. British pilots are described as determined, skilled, and increasingly confident. The idea of Britain's Air Force collapsing fades quickly. By late 1940, Luftwaffe crews no longer speak of easy victory. They speak of endurance, Britain's and their own. Angle 3. The naval view, Britain at sea. At sea, German perceptions harden into something close to admiration. U-boat commanders and surface crews confront a navy that seems omnipresent. British escorts respond faster than expected. Convoys adjust routes. Anti-submarine tactics improve month by month. Early successes give way to attrition. British losses hurt, but they do not cripple. Shipyards continue producing replacements. Escorts grow more numerous. Detection improves. German sailors note the professionalism of British crews. They fight through damage. They remain disciplined under attack. The Royal Navy appears methodical rather than emotional, committed to long-term survival rather than dramatic victories. This frustrates German expectations of rapid economic strangulation. Britain's maritime system bends, but it does not break. Among sailors, Britain is increasingly described not as decadent, but as resilient, an enemy built for endurance. By the end of 1941, 3 different branches of the German military have reached similar conclusions independently. Britain is not collapsing. It is adapting, and it is prepared to fight for years if necessary. That realization opens the door to deeper questions, not just about Britain's soldiers, pilots, and sailors, but about the people and leadership behind them. As the war stretches on, German soldiers begin to look beyond individual encounters and focus on how Britain is being led. What they notice first is consistency. British strategy does not swing wildly with losses. There are no sudden purges of commanders, no visible panic at the top. Orders remain coherent. Objectives are adjusted rather than abandoned. German officers studying British operations observe a command culture that values preparation and coordination over spectacle. British attacks are rarely impulsive. When they fail, they are analyzed, refined, and attempted again in altered form. This steadiness contrasts sharply with expectations. German propaganda had painted Britain's leadership as divided, indecisive, overly political. On the battlefield, however, British command appears methodical and deliberate. Prisoner interrogations reinforce this impression. British officers display confidence in their chain of command. They expect reinforcements. They expect continuity. They speak as men who believe time is on their side. For German soldiers accustomed to rapid, decisive campaigns, this patience is deeply frustrating. Britain does not seem interested in dramatic victory. It seems interested in survival and eventual dominance through endurance. Angle 5. The civilian factor, a nation that absorbs war. Perhaps the most unsettling realization for German soldiers comes not from the battlefield, but from reports about British civilians. The bombing campaign is meant to break morale. Instead, it reveals something unexpected. German aircrew report cities continuing to function after heavy raids. Fires are contained. Infrastructure is repaired. Civil defense organizations operate efficiently. Workers return to factories. Intelligence summaries note that while fear exists, it does not translate into collapse. Civilians adapt to nightly raids. Shelters become routine. Damage becomes a problem to solve, not a reason to surrender. Letters from German soldiers reflect confusion. They had been told that British society was fragile, dependent on comfort and stability. Yet it proves capable of absorbing disruption without disintegration. This resilience alters perceptions profoundly. Britain is no longer viewed solely as a military opponent. It is seen as a society prepared for hardship, a nation that has accepted suffering as the cost of survival. For German soldiers, this creates a moral tension. The enemy is no longer faceless. It is composed of civilians who endure, rebuild, and continue. Angle 6, the weight behind Britain, empire, industry time. As the war expands, German soldiers begin to grasp the scale behind Britain's resistance. Britain is not alone. Its empire stretches across continents. Its resources flow from beyond Europe. German intelligence briefings increasingly acknowledge this reality. Supplies arrive from overseas. Factories operate beyond reach. Allies contribute manpower and material. This realization reshapes how Britain is perceived. It is no longer just an island resisting invasion. It is a node in a global system, one that cannot be easily severed. For many German soldiers, this marks the final shift in perception. Britain is not a temporary obstacle. is a permanent one, a nation built not for swift victory, but for prolonged conflict. By this stage of the war, the tone in letters and diaries has changed completely. Mockery is gone. Certainty has vanished. What remains is respect mixed with frustration, and a growing sense that the war against Britain is not unfolding as planned. That sense will soon harden into something more severe, because the coming phase of the conflict will force German soldiers to confront a single, unavoidable truth. Britain is not just resisting, it is reshaping the war itself. By late summer 1940, the war against Britain reaches a decisive psychological edge. For German soldiers, the moment does not arrive with a single explosion or order. It arrives through repetition, through exhaustion, through the slow realization that something fundamental has failed. The air campaign intensifies. Expectations are clear. Destroy Britain's air defenses. Break its morale. Force negotiation. The logic appears sound. The pressure is relentless. But the outcome refuses to align with the plan. Luftwaffe crews fly day after day into increasingly dangerous skies. Losses accumulate. Aircraft return riddled with damage. Some do not return at all. The British response grows sharper, faster, more coordinated. What troubles German pilots most is not the fighting itself, but its effect. There is no visible breaking point. Airfields continue operating. Fighter squadrons rotate. Radar stations reappear after attacks. British aircraft keep rising to meet them. The anticipated collapse never comes. Inside German mess halls and briefing rooms, the tone changes. Optimistic projections are replaced by cautious language. Commanders speak less of victory and more of attrition. On the ground, soldiers listen to radio reports that strain credibility. Claims of British losses sound excessive. Victory deadlines quietly disappear. Privately, German servicemen notice the discrepancy. They know what they are seeing. They know how many aircraft fail to return. They know the enemy is still fighting. The channel becomes a barrier not just of water, but of uncertainty. Invasion preparations stall. Barges sit idle. Weather reports are scrutinized endlessly. Every delay feels heavier than the last. For many German soldiers, this period marks the first time the war feels out of control. Britain has not been defeated. It has not negotiated. It has not fractured internally. Instead, it has endured. The psychological impact is profound. German soldiers have been trained for rapid campaigns, decisive blows, clear outcomes. Britain offers none of these. It absorbs pressure and continues. Letters home reflect frustration and disbelief. Some soldiers admit confusion. Others express grudging respect. A few begin to question whether Britain can be beaten at all without unacceptable cost. This is not open dissent. It is quiet erosion. Confidence drains slowly, not through panic, but through repetition of failure. Every day, Britain remains in the war undermines the certainty that defined the early campaigns. Every failed expectation chips away at the belief in inevitability. By the end of the year, one fact is impossible to ignore. Britain has survived the moment it was supposed to fall. 4 German soldiers. That survival marks a turning point. The enemy they once dismissed now stands as proof that the war will not be short, not clean, and not predictable. And if Britain cannot be forced to surrender, then the war itself must change. That realization sets the stage for the next, darker phase of the conflict, one defined not by swift conquest, but by grinding endurance. Once Britain survives the moment meant to destroy it, the war takes on a new shape. For German soldiers, this shift is unmistakable. The focus moves away from decisive blows and toward prolonged pressure. Bombing continues, but its purpose changes. No longer aimed solely at forcing surrender, it becomes an effort to exhaust industry, morale, patience. Yet even this strategy fails to deliver the expected result. Cities are damaged, lives are lost, but Britain does not retreat from the war. It reorganizes, production disperses, air defenses adapt, civil routines harden around disruption. German air crews begin to sense that each raid achieves less than the one before. Targets are hit, but their effect diminishes. Britain absorbs punishment and adjusts. At sea, the pattern repeats. U-boat crews experience initial success, followed by mounting resistance. Convoys grow stronger. Escort tactics improve. Detection becomes more precise. Losses among submarines rise steadily. What had once felt like a war of opportunity begins to feel like a contest of endurance, and Britain appears better prepared for it. German soldiers begin to speak differently in private, not of victory timelines, but of duration, not of conquest, but of survival. The language becomes heavier, more cautious. There's also a psychological isolation. Britain remains in the war when others have fallen. It becomes a constant presence, unbroken, unyielding. German soldiers realize that as long as Britain fights on, the war cannot end. This realization deepens with time. By 1941 and beyond, Britain is no longer the primary battlefield for many German units, but it remains the strategic anchor of resistance. It is the base from which pressure will return, the place from which future offensives will be launched. German soldiers sense this even before it becomes visible. In letters and diaries, Britain is described as waiting, preparing, building strength, biding time. That perception is perhaps the most unsettling of all. Britain is not reacting blindly. It is enduring deliberately. 4 German servicemen raised on the idea of decisive action. This patience feels dangerous. The enemy is no longer trying to win quickly. It is trying to outlast. As years pass, this truth becomes impossible to ignore. Britain does not break under bombing. It does not starve under blockade. It does not collapse politically. Instead, it becomes a fixed point in the war, the reference by which all other campaigns are measured. For many German soldiers, this marks the final acceptance of reality. Britain will not be defeated easily. Perhaps not at all. The war they imagined, short, controlled, victorious, has transformed into something far larger, far more uncertain. And Britain, once dismissed as a declining power, now stands as one of the central reasons the war continues. That understanding settles quietly among the ranks, not with speeches, not with orders, but with the weight of time and the growing certainty that the enemy across the channel has already changed the course of the war. As the war moves beyond its early phases, German soldiers carry their experiences with Britain into every subsequent campaign. The initial contempt is gone. In its place is something more complex, an acknowledgement shaped by years of resistance, adaptation, and refusal to yield. By the mid-war period, internal German reports speak openly of Britain as a capable, determined opponent. The language is no longer dismissive. British forces are described as organized, resilient, and increasingly effective. Tactical lessons are drawn from British methods rather than ignored. Among the rank and file, this shift is even more pronounced. Letters home reference Britain not as a target to be crushed, but as an obstacle that will not disappear. Soldiers write of Britain's ability to recover from losses, of its consistent leadership, of its civilians who continue working despite air raids. There is a sense that Britain has absorbed the shock of war and emerged hardened rather than weakened. This realization carries strategic consequences. German soldiers understand, even if only intuitively, that as long as Britain remains in the war, Germany cannot fully secure its gains. The island becomes a base for future pressure, a staging ground for operations yet to come. This awareness alters morale. The war no longer feels like a sequence of victories leading toward conclusion. It feels open-ended. Britain's survival ensures that the conflict will extend, intensify, and widen. For some German soldiers, this produces resignation. For others, frustration. For a few, grudging respect. There is also a growing recognition of miscalculation. Britain had been assessed through ideology rather than reality. Its social cohesion, industrial capacity, and strategic patience have been underestimated. German soldiers come to realize that defeating Britain would require resources and sacrifices beyond what had been planned. This recognition is rarely expressed publicly. It exists in private writing, in quiet conversations, in the spaces where propaganda does not reach. By this stage, Britain has become something symbolic. It represents endurance. It represents refusal. It represents the failure of easy victory. German soldiers now view Britain not simply as an enemy nation, but as a constant pressure shaping every decision. Its presence influences deployments, strategy, and long-term planning. Even when attention shifts eastward or southward, Britain remains in the background, unbroken, watching, waiting. And that persistence leaves its mark. As the war grinds on, German soldiers begin to understand that Britain's greatest weapon was not a single battle or campaign, but time. Time to adapt. Time to rebuild. Time to prepare. That understanding sets the stage for the final phase of reflection, when the war's outcome becomes unavoidable and Britain's role in it can no longer be denied. By the later years of the war, German soldiers no longer debate what Britain is. They know. The question is no longer whether Britain can be defeated, but what its continued resistance has already made inevitable. Prisoners of war, held in camps across Britain and the wider Allied world, reflect on the years that led them there. In interrogations and post-war testimony, many acknowledge that Britain's refusal to surrender changed everything. It denied Germany the closure of an early victory. It ensured the war expanded rather than ended. Among frontline units, this realization arrives gradually but firmly. Every new campaign is fought with the knowledge that Britain remains active, that its aircraft, ships, and intelligence networks are still in play, that supplies and reinforcements continue to flow across the Atlantic. That time is no longer on Germany's side. German soldiers begin to speak of Britain with a tone that borders on inevitability. Not admiration in the romantic sense, but respect earned through endurance. Britain is recognized as the opponent that refused to provide relief from the war. The one enemy that did not collapse, did not negotiate, did not fracture under pressure. In this sense, Britain becomes a psychological constant. A reminder that the conflict will continue until something fundamental breaks, not on the island, but elsewhere. For many German soldiers, that understanding carries bitterness. Britain is blamed for prolonging the war, for preventing a settlement, for forcing Germany into a conflict of attrition it was not prepared to sustain indefinitely. Yet even this resentment is shaped by acknowledgement. Britain fought on when it stood alone. It absorbed losses without surrender. It rebuilt faster than expected. By the final stages of the war, this assessment is no longer controversial within the ranks. It is accepted reality. British persistence is seen as one of the defining features of the conflict, not because it won every battle, but because it refused to lose the war. German soldiers who survive carry this lesson with them long after the fighting ends. In memoirs and reflections, Britain is often described not as brilliant or flawless, but as immovable, an enemy that could not be frightened into submission, an enemy that understood the value of waiting. In the end, Britain's role is not measured by dramatic collapse or conquest, but by continuity. It stayed. It endured. It remained present when others fell. And for the men who once stood on the coast, staring across the channel, that truth becomes impossible to ignore. The island they were told would break never did. In the quiet years after the war, historians and veterans alike return to the question that had haunted German soldiers from the first. What was Britain? It was not an empire in decline. It was not an easy conquest. It was a nation that had endured, adapted, and refused to bend. For the soldiers who once looked across the Channel with certainty, Britain became a lesson in patience and resilience. Their encounters, air battles over London, naval skirmishes in the Atlantic, letters exchanged with captured foes, revealed a society and a military that did not follow predictions. It acted according to principle and preparation, not fear. Psychologically, this endurance reshaped the war. German expectations of rapid victory collapsed. Battles became drawn out. Campaigns extended beyond planning. Strategy was forced to adjust to a stubborn constant. And yet, the significance extends beyond strategy and territory. Britain's refusal to collapse reflected something deeper: the human capacity to persist under pressure. Civilians and soldiers alike bore suffering with quiet determination. Cities rebuilt, airfields repaired, supply lines rerouted. The enemy who once expected surrender learned instead the weight of resistance. In this sense, the story is not only military, it is moral, emotional, and profoundly human. It reminds us that power is measured not just in weapons, formations, or technology, but in endurance, in the refusal to yield when the world expects you to break. For German soldiers, Britain became both obstacle and mirror. It revealed their own assumptions, weaknesses, and the limits of certainty. It forced them to confront that victory is never guaranteed, even against what appears to be a weakened opponent. And for history, it stands as a testament that resilience can alter the course of war more than any battle plan, more than any sudden offensive, more than the fastest advance. Britain endured. It persisted. It remained. And in doing so, it reshaped not just the outcome of conflict, but the perception of the enemy who once believed it could be defeated in a single campaign. The Channel is still there, quiet and gray. It separates lands, but also carries memory, the memory of a nation that would not yield, and of soldiers who came to understand that some enemies are defined less by what they fight and more by what they endure.